So you need to leave the lobby right now, before we call security. The words cut through the quiet luxury of the Aurora Grand Hotel like a dropped glass in a silent room. Conversation stopped. A few guests slowly turned their heads. The marble floor reflected the tall figure standing near the center of the lobby, a man who clearly did not look like he belonged among the polished shoes and tailored suits surrounding him. Marcus Reed stood there holding a worn envelope in one hand, his broad shoulders steady even though the attention of the entire room had shifted toward him. His jacket was clean but old, the dark fabric faded from years of work under the sun. His boots carried faint marks of engine oil that no amount of scrubbing ever completely removed. The chandelier above cast soft golden light across the marble pillars and velvet chairs, and that light seemed to expose every detail that made him different from the wealthy guests sipping sparkling water near the reception desk. Marcus did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he simply looked toward the tall glass entrance doors as if he expected someone to walk through them at any moment. The manager standing before him, a tall man named Lucas Bennett, folded his arms with practiced authority. His suit was perfectly pressed, and his expression carried the quiet confidence of someone who was used to deciding who belonged in places like this. Several guests nearby whispered to each other. One woman lowered her voice and said that the man must have wandered in by mistake. Another guest glanced toward the concierge desk and shook his head as if the situation was an inconvenience to the calm elegance of the afternoon. Marcus could feel every pair of eyes in the room measuring him, judging him, trying to place him into a story that made sense to them. A mechanic from the south side of Chicago did not normally appear inside a five-star hotel lobby surrounded by polished brass railings and velvet ropes. Yet Marcus remained still, his eyes calm, his breathing slow. He checked the large clock mounted on the far wall above the reception desk. The minute hand moved quietly forward. He had been waiting only a few minutes. To everyone else in the room, it probably looked like he was lost, or worse, like he was refusing to follow the polite request of hotel staff. But Marcus knew exactly why he was there. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Marcus lowered his gaze to the envelope in his hand. The paper was slightly creased from being carried in his jacket pocket all morning. Inside that envelope was a letter written in careful handwriting, a message that had arrived at his small apartment only 3 days earlier. The letter had invited him to this very place, the Aurora Grand Hotel, and it had asked him to arrive at exactly 3 in the afternoon. Marcus had read those lines more than a dozen times before deciding to come. Now he stood in the center of the lobby while the manager waited impatiently for him to leave. Lucas Bennett stepped a little closer and spoke again, this time more firmly, telling Marcus that guests were beginning to feel uncomfortable. Marcus looked up slowly and met the manager's eyes with quiet patience. "I am waiting for someone," he said calmly. The manager let out a small breath of disbelief, as if the answer confirmed what he already suspected. Around them, the whispers continued, the sound of expensive shoes shifting against polished marble. And just beyond the tall glass doors of the hotel entrance, a black car had begun to slow as it approached the curb outside. The black car outside the Aurora Grand rolled to a slow and deliberate stop beside the polished curb, its dark paint reflecting the golden lights that spilled from the hotel entrance. But inside the lobby, the tension continued to grow thicker with every passing second. Marcus Reed stood exactly where he had been moments earlier, his broad shoulders calm and steady while the murmurs around him slowly intensified. Lucas Bennett, the hotel manager, glanced briefly toward the entrance doors before returning his attention to Marcus with a look that carried both impatience and authority. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one final time to leave the lobby," Lucas said, his voice measured but firmer than before. "This space is reserved for registered guests and scheduled visitors." Marcus did not move. He kept his posture relaxed, his hands steady at his sides, the worn envelope still resting lightly between his fingers. "I told you. Already," Marcus replied in a calm voice. "I am waiting for someone." Lucas exhaled slowly through his nose, the patience in his expression fading just enough for the surrounding guests to notice. Around them, the elegant lobby continued its quiet performance of wealth and refinement. A pianist in the corner played soft notes that echoed gently beneath the high ceiling. A couple seated near the marble fountain whispered to one another while watching the scene unfold as though it were unexpected entertainment. A man wearing a tailored navy suit leaned closer to his companion and said under his breath that the staff should have handled this already. Lucas lifted one hand slightly and motioned toward the two uniformed security guards standing near the reception desk. The guards were tall men with calm faces trained for situations exactly like this. They walked forward with careful professionalism, their polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor as they approached Marcus. "Sir," one of the guards said politely, "we're going to escort you outside now." Marcus turned his head slightly toward the man and nodded once in acknowledgement, but he still did not step away from where he stood. The guard hesitated for a brief moment, clearly surprised by the quiet confidence in Marcus' posture. Most people in this situation would have already begun explaining themselves, apologizing, or raising their voices in frustration. Marcus did none of those things. Instead, he simply looked toward the large clock mounted on the far wall again. The minute hand had moved forward another small distance. Only a few minutes had passed since the manager first approached him, yet the entire room seemed to believe the moment had stretched into something much larger. Lucas crossed his arms again. "Sir, if you do not leave, immediately we will be forced to remove you from the property." Marcus looked back at him calmly. "I understand," Marcus said, "but I'm exactly where I am supposed to be." That quiet answer stirred a ripple of disbelief among the watching guests. A woman near the concierge desk shook her head slightly, as if she had just witnessed someone refuse a simple and obvious instruction. Another guest raised his phone slightly, as though considering recording the scene before thinking better of it. Lucas stepped closer to Marcus now, lowering his voice so that only the nearest people could hear him. "This is a 5-star hotel," he said carefully. "People come here expecting privacy and comfort. When someone walks in dress like you are, it raises concerns." Marcus' eyes remained steady. "I did not come here to cause problems," he replied quietly. "I came because someone asked me to be here." Lucas gave a short and skeptical laugh under his breath. "And who exactly would that be?" Marcus lowered his gaze to the envelope again. For a brief moment the room seemed to grow even quieter, as if the building itself were listening. Marcus carefully opened the envelope and slid out the folded letter inside. The paper was simple and clean, the handwriting neat and deliberate. He unfolded it slowly and held it where Lucas could see the signature at the bottom. Lucas leaned forward just enough to read the name. His expression shifted slightly, though he quickly masked the reaction. The name written, there was Victoria Bennett, the owner of the Aurora Grand Hotel. For a moment, Lucas said nothing at all. Then he straightened again and gave a small, dismissive shake of his head. "Anyone could write a name on a piece of paper," he said calmly. "That does not mean anything." Marcus folded the letter again with care and returned it to the envelope. He slipped the envelope back into his jacket pocket and looked once more toward the glass doors at the front of the lobby. Outside, the black car had fully stopped at the curb, and the driver had just stepped out to open the rear door. Marcus watched quietly as the door began to swing open, and the murmurs in the lobby slowly faded into a deep and curious silence. The rear door of the black car opened slowly, and the driver stepped back with quiet precision, as if the moment carried more importance than the usual arrival of a guest. Inside the Aurora Grand lobby, every whisper faded into a curious silence. Even the soft piano music drifting from the corner seemed to lose its presence as attention shifted toward the tall glass doors. Marcus Reed stood still near the center of the polished marble floor, his calm eyes fixed on the entrance while the people around him leaned slightly to see who would step out of the vehicle. Lucas Bennett followed Marcus' gaze for a brief moment before returning his focus to the man standing in front of him. Whatever confidence Lucas had carried only moments earlier now mixed with a small trace of uncertainty. Still, he refused to show it openly. "Sir, I do not know what game you think you are playing," Lucas said in a controlled voice, "but you are not fooling anyone here. The name on that letter means nothing unless the person who wrote it is actually expecting you." Marcus did not answer immediately. His eyes remained steady on the entrance doors where the driver now held the car, door fully open. A tall silhouette began to emerge from the vehicle, though the tinted glass and the angle of the afternoon light made it difficult to see clearly from inside the lobby. Several guests instinctively straightened in their seats as recognition slowly began to move through the room like a quiet ripple. One of the security guards glanced toward Lucas as if silently asking whether they should continue removing Marcus before the arriving guest entered the building. Lucas gave a slight nod, determined not to lose control of the situation in front of his staff and the watching patrons. The two guards stepped closer to Marcus again. "Sir, we need you to come with us now," the first guard said, his tone still respectful but firmer than before. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, not resisting but also not stepping away from where he stood. "I will walk outside if that is what you decide," he said calmly. "But the person I am waiting for is already here." His quiet confidence caused a few of the guests to exchange confused glances. The statement sounded almost certain, as though Marcus knew something that none of them did. Lucas' jaw tightened slightly. He turned halfway toward the entrance, clearly irritated by the growing attention surrounding the scene. This situation had already lasted far longer than it should have. The glass doors began to slide open as the hotel doorman stepped forward with professional courtesy. Warm afternoon light spilled across the marble floor just as the arriving guest stepped through the entrance. The change in the atmosphere was immediate. Several employees standing behind the reception desk straightened their posture. The concierge quietly adjusted his tie. A few guests who recognized the newcomer stood up without even realizing they had done so. Victoria Bennett walked into the Aurora Grand with the calm confidence of someone who had crossed that lobby floor countless times before. Her dark coat moved gently with each step, and the quiet authority in her presence filled the room more powerfully than any spoken announcement. Lucas Bennett's expression changed instantly when he saw her. Victoria Bennett was not only the owner of the hotel, but also his aunt, the person who had trusted him with the responsibility of managing the entire property. Lucas took a quick step forward, preparing to greet her as he always did when she visited the hotel unexpectedly. "Good afternoon," Lucas began respectfully as he approached her path. But Victoria's attention had already shifted past him. Her eyes moved across the lobby until they stopped on the tall figure standing near the center of the room. For a brief moment, she did not speak. The people nearby noticed the pause and followed her line of sight until they too were looking at Marcus Reed. The room held its breath in a quiet stillness. Victoria took one slow step forward, then another, her gaze never leaving Marcus. Lucas turned slightly, confused by the direction of her attention. He looked back at Marcus and then again at Victoria, trying to understand what he was seeing. Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing since the beginning of the confrontation, his calm expression unchanged. For several seconds, the only sound in the grand lobby was the soft echo of Victoria Bennett footsteps crossing the marble floor as she walked directly toward the man everyone else had just tried to remove from the building. Victoria Bennett continued walking across the marble lobby floor with calm, deliberate steps, her eyes locked on Marcus Reed, as if the rest of the room had suddenly disappeared. The quiet authority in her presence made the entire space feel smaller, more focused, as though every chandelier and polished column existed only to witness the moment unfolding between the two of them. Lucas Bennett felt a sudden tightness in his chest as he watched her approach the man he had just ordered removed from the building. His mind moved quickly through possibilities, trying to understand why his aunt would ignore the greeting he had offered and instead walk directly toward someone who clearly did not look like a typical guest of the Aurora Grand. Around them, the guests who had been whispering moments earlier now stood. In silent curiosity, the security guards had stopped only a few feet from Marcus, unsure whether to continue their escort or step aside, now that the owner herself had entered the scene. Victoria stopped several steps in front of Marcus and studied his face carefully. Her expression did not carry anger or confusion. Instead, there was something deeper there, something thoughtful and searching, as if she were trying to match the man standing before her with a memory that had lived quietly in the back of her mind for years. Marcus met her gaze with the same calm patience he had shown since the beginning of the confrontation. He had not stepped forward. He did not offer an explanation. He simply waited. Lucas cleared his throat and moved closer to them, forcing a polite smile onto his face even though uncertainty continued to grow inside him. "Aunt Victoria," he said carefully, "we were just handling a situation with this gentleman. He was asked to leave the lobby because he does not appear to be a registered guest." Victoria did not immediately respond to Lucas. Her attention remained on Marcus for another long moment before she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Marcus Reed." She said the name as if she had repeated it many times before. A subtle shift moved through the watching crowd. The security guards exchanged quick glances with one another. Lucas blinked in confusion. Marcus inclined his head slightly. "Good afternoon, Miss Bennett," he said in a respectful tone. The sound of his voice seemed to confirm something inside her memory. Victoria exhaled softly and a faint smile appeared at the corners of her mouth, though it was not the polite smile of a hotel owner greeting a guest. It was warmer than that, more personal. "You came," she said. "I was beginning to worry that the letter might not have reached you." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and gently touched the envelope resting there. "It reached me," he replied. "I was not sure why you wanted to see me after all this time, but I thought it was important that I come." Lucas looked from one face to the other, his confusion growing stronger with each word. "Aunt Victoria," he said slowly, "you know this man." Victoria turned her head toward him then, the warmth in her expression fading slightly as she took in the scene around them. Her eyes moved briefly toward the two security guards standing nearby and then back to Lucas. "I don't know him," she said. Her tone carried a quiet firmness that made Lucas straighten unconsciously. "In fact, I was the one who invited him here today." The words settled over the lobby like a sudden shift in the air. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. One of the security guards stepped back immediately, lowering his hands in silent apology for having approached Marcus earlier. Lucas felt his face grow warm as the meaning of her statement fully reached him. "You invited him," Lucas repeated quietly. Victoria nodded once. "Yes," she said. "I asked Marcus Reed to meet me here this afternoon." Her gaze moved briefly to the guards again before returning to Lucas. "So perhaps you can explain why the man I personally invited to this hotel was just seconds away from being escorted out of my lobby." Lucas' mouth opened slightly, but no immediate answer came. He glanced toward Marcus again, seeing him now not as a stranger in worn work boots, but as someone the owner herself had requested to see. The room remained silent, every person waiting to hear what explanation the manager of the Aurora Grand would offer next. Lucas Bennett stood frozen for a moment as the quiet weight of Victoria Bennett words settled over the entire lobby. The polished marble floor reflected the stunned faces of guests and staff alike, while the soft piano music in the corner continued as if nothing unusual had happened, though every person in the room knew something important had just shifted. Lucas straightened his jacket slowly, forcing himself to regain the confident posture expected of the manager of the Aurora Grand Hotel. "Aunt Victoria," he began carefully, "I was simply following standard hotel policy." This gentleman entered the lobby without identifying himself as a guest, and several people expressed concern. "My responsibility is to maintain comfort and security for everyone here." Victoria listened without interrupting, though the calm expression on her face did not soften. Her eyes moved briefly toward Marcus Reed again before returning to Lucas. "I appreciate your concern for the hotel reputation," she said evenly, "but I am curious about something." She gestured gently toward Marcus with an open hand. "Did you ask him why he was here?" Lucas hesitated for a fraction of a second. "He said he was waiting for someone," Lucas replied. Victoria nodded slowly. "And did it occur to you that the someone he was waiting for might have been the person who owns this building?" A quiet ripple moved through the watching crowd. Lucas felt the heat rise in his face as he realized how that exchange must sound to everyone listening. "I did not believe that explanation was credible," Lucas said carefully. Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Because of his clothing." Lucas looked toward Marcus' boots and jacket without meaning to. The faint marks of engine oil were still visible beneath the chandelier light. That was one of the factors, Lucas admitted. Marcus remained silent, though he noticed several guests now watching Lucas rather than him. The direction of judgment in the room had begun to change. Victoria folded her hands in front of her and took a slow breath. The Aurora Grand was built on the idea that every person who walks through those doors deserves dignity and respect, she said quietly. That principle does not disappear simply because someone arrives wearing work boots instead of a tailored suit. Lucas lowered his gaze briefly, aware that the entire staff standing behind the reception desk could hear every word she spoke. I understand that now, he said. Victoria studied him for another moment before turning fully toward Marcus. I apologize for the way you were treated when you arrived, she said sincerely. You should have been welcomed the moment you stepped through the door. Marcus shook his head gently. There's no need for an apology, Miss Bennet, he said calmly. I have been in many places where people assume things about me before asking a single question. It does not surprise me anymore. The honesty in his voice made several guests shift uncomfortably. Victoria's expression softened slightly. That may be true, she said, but it does not mean it should happen here. She turned back toward Lucas again. Please make sure the staff understands that the man standing here today is someone I personally asked to see. Lucas nodded quickly. Of course. He looked toward the security guards who had stepped back earlier. That will not be necessary anymore, gentlemen, Lucas said quietly. The guards moved away without hesitation, returning to their positions near the reception desk. The tension in the room eased slightly, though curiosity still filled the air. Several guests leaned forward in their chairs, as if expecting something more to happen. Victoria turned toward Marcus again, and the warmth returned to her expression. I'm very grateful that you came today, she said. There is something important I have wanted to discuss with you for many years. Marcus looked at her with a thoughtful expression. Your letter mentioned that, he replied, but did not explain why now. Victoria glanced around the lobby briefly, noticing the number of curious eyes still focused on them. This conversation deserves a quieter setting than the center of a crowded lobby, she said gently. She gestured toward the private elevators near the far wall of the hotel. Would you be willing to join me upstairs so we can talk? Marcus considered the invitation for a moment before nodding. Yes, Miss Bennet, he said. I would like that. Victoria smiled softly and turned toward the elevators. As she began walking, Marcus followed beside her while the guests and staff of the Aurora Grand watched in silent fascination. Lucas remained where he stood, still processing everything that had just unfolded. And as the elevator doors began to close behind Marcus Reed and Victoria Bennet, one question continued to echo quietly in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the moment. Who exactly was the man that the owner of the Aurora Grand had waited so many years to meet again? The private elevator doors closed with a soft sound that seemed to seal Marcus Reed and Victoria Bennet away from the curious eyes of the Aurora Grand lobby. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the elevator motor filled the small space as the car began to move upward through the building. The polished brass walls reflected the two figures standing across from one another, one dressed in a tailored coat that carried the quiet authority of ownership, the other in worn work boots that had spent years standing on concrete garage floors. Marcus kept his hands relaxed at his sides while Victoria studied him carefully, as if confirming again that the man standing before her was real and not simply a memory that had walked out of the past. It has been a long time, Marcus, she said gently. Marcus nodded once. Yes, it has, Miss Bennet. I did not expect to hear from you again after all these years. Victoria smiled faintly at that. Please call me Victoria, she said. After everything that happened, it feels strange to hear you address me so formally. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, but his calm expression remained unchanged. Old habits are hard to break, he replied quietly. The elevator passed another floor with a soft mechanical chime before continuing upward. Victoria folded her hands in front of her as if organizing her thoughts. I have thought about that night more times than I can count, she said slowly. There are moments in life when everything changes in the space of a few minutes. That night was one of them. Marcus' eyes moved briefly to the floor indicator above the elevator door. The numbers continued to climb one by one. It was a long time ago, he said. People move on from things like that. Victoria shook her head gently. Some people do, but not all of us. The elevator slowed slightly as it approached the upper floors of the hotel. Outside the glass walls of the building, the skyline of the city stretched across the horizon under the warm light of the afternoon sun. Victoria stepped a little closer, lowering her voice as if the conversation carried more weight than the quiet elevator deserved. When my assistant finally located you last month, I could hardly believe it. For years I tried to find you. There were records missing, and the police report from that night was incomplete. No one seemed to know where you had gone. Marcus looked at her with quiet curiosity. You were looking for me. Victoria Nadif. I wanted to thank you properly. The elevator slowed to a stop, and the doors opened onto a quiet private hallway reserved for executive offices and the owner's suite. Soft carpet replaced the echo of marble, and large windows allowed natural light to fill the corridor. Victoria stepped out first, and Marcus followed a moment later. They walked slowly toward a wide set of double doors at the end of the hallway. You saved my life that night, Marcus, Victoria said quietly as they walked. Marcus shook his head slightly. Anyone would have done the same thing if they had seen what was happening. Victoria stopped walking and turned toward him with a serious expression. That is not true, she said. Many people saw the situation that evening, but you were the only one who stepped forward. Marcus remained silent for a moment as the memory seemed to pass through his mind like a distant echo. The sound of rain, a dark street, a frightened young woman running through the night. I did not think about it much afterward, he said finally. I helped someone who needed help, and then I went back to my life. Victoria studied his face again. That simple decision changed the direction of my entire future, she said softly. She opened the double doors and stepped into a large office that overlooked the city skyline. The room was quiet and elegant, with tall windows and warm sunlight reflecting across polished wood furniture. Marcus paused near the entrance while Victoria walked toward a table near the window. She turned back toward him and spoke with gentle sincerity. I did not invite you here only to say thank you, Marcus. There is something much more important that I need to talk to you about today. Marcus looked at her with calm curiosity as the late afternoon light filled the room around them. And whatever Victoria Bennett was about to say next had been waiting more than 10 years to finally be spoken. Marcus Reed remained near the entrance of the office while the late afternoon light stretched across the wide windows behind Victoria Bennett, painting long golden reflections across the polished wood floor. The city skyline outside looked calm and distant, but inside the room the silence carried a quiet tension that had been building for years. Marcus slowly walked farther into the office, his boots making soft sounds against the floor as he approached the table near the window. Victoria watched him carefully, as if she were still confirming that the man she had searched for all this time was truly standing in front of her. When Marcus finally stopped a few feet away, he folded his hands loosely in front of him and waited. You said there was something important you wanted to discuss, Marcus said calmly. Victoria nodded, though she seemed to take a moment to collect her thoughts before speaking again. Yes, there is, she replied. And I believe it is something that should have been done a very long time ago. She walked slowly toward a cabinet beside the window and opened a drawer, removing a thin leather folder that had clearly been kept safe for years. She returned to the table and placed the folder down carefully between them. Marcus' eyes moved to the folder, but he did not reach for it. Instead, he looked back at Victoria. What is it? He asked. Victoria rested one hand on the folder for a moment before answering. After the night you saved me, everything in my life began to change. My family business was already growing, but that experience made me see the world differently. I realized how fragile everything truly is. Marcus listened quietly. He did not interrupt. Victoria continued speaking, her voice thoughtful and sincere. The Aurora Grand was still under construction back then. My father had planned for me to take over the company one day, but after what happened that night, I began making my own decisions much earlier than anyone expected. She opened the folder slowly and turned it so Marcus could see the documents inside. Marcus stepped closer and glanced down. The pages contained legal papers, each one neatly arranged and signed in careful handwriting. I spent years trying to locate you because I believed you deserved something in return for what you did, Victoria explained. Marcus lifted his eyes from the documents and looked at her again. I never expected anything for helping someone who needed it, he said quietly. Victoria Nadif, I know. That is exactly why you deserve it. She gently tapped the top page of the folder. Marcus looked down again and read the heading more carefully. It was a formal ownership agreement connected to the Aurora Grand Hotel itself. His brow tightened slightly as he read further. Victoria watched his reaction. These papers transfer a percentage of ownership in this hotel to you. Marcus, she said calmly. The words settled into the quiet office like a stone dropped into still water. Marcus looked up again, clearly surprised but still composed. A percentage of the hotel, he repeated slowly. Victoria Nadif. Yes, I wanted to give you something that would truly reflect the value of what you did that night. Marcus remained silent for several seconds as he considered what she was saying. The skyline outside the window glowed in the warm light of the afternoon, while the city below moved with its usual rhythm, unaware of the decision unfolding inside the office above. Finally, Marcus shook his head. Gently. Victoria, that is far more than I ever expected. Victoria met his gaze firmly. You saved my life when no one else stepped forward. You gave me the chance to build everything that exists here today. That kind of courage cannot simply be thanked with words. Marcus looked down at the papers once more. The numbers written across the document represented a life-changing amount of money, far beyond anything he had ever imagined for himself. Still, he did not immediately reach for the pen resting beside the folder. Instead, he looked back at Victoria with a thoughtful expression. There is something you should understand about me before I make a decision like this, he said quietly. Victoria guati paciently. Marcus took a slow breath. Helping you that night was the right thing to do. But accepting something like this could change my life in ways I am not sure I want. Victoria studied his face carefully. The calm honesty in his voice made her realize that the conversation she had waited 10 years to have might not end the way she had expected. Marcus Reed stood quietly beside the wide office table while the city skyline glowed through the tall windows behind Victoria Bennett. The leather folder remained open between them, the documents inside still untouched. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The weight of the decision hung in the air like a quiet storm waiting to break. Victoria watched Marcus carefully, studying the thoughtful expression on his face. She had expected surprise when he saw the documents, perhaps even disbelief. What she had not expected was hesitation. Most people, she knew, would have signed those papers without reading the second page. Yet Marcus had not even reached for the pen. Finally, Victoria spoke again, her voice calm but sincere. I understand that this is unexpected, Marcus, she said, but I want you to know that this decision was not made lightly. I have spent many years thinking about how to properly thank you. Marcus nodded slowly, still looking down at the documents. I believe that, he replied quietly, and I'm grateful that you remembered what happened that night. Victoria gave a faint smile. Remembered. Marcus, I relived that night in my mind for years. There are moments in life that never fade, no matter how much time passes. Marcus lifted his eyes toward her. Again, that may be true, he said, but the truth is that I did what any decent person should do. I saw someone in danger, and I stepped in. Victoria leaned forward slightly. But no one else did, she said gently. Marcus considered her words before answering. Sometimes people freeze when they are afraid. It does not mean they are bad people. Victoria studied him for a moment, realizing again how calm and grounded he was. The years had not changed that about him. She remembered the way he had stood between her and the men who were chasing her that night in the rain, calm even then, as if courage were simply part of his nature. Marcus looked down at the papers again. This offer would change my life, he said slowly, but it would also change the way people see me. Victoria tilted her head slightly. How so? Marcus rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair beside him. I've spent most of my life working with my hands. I fix engines. I solve problems in garages where people respect you because you do honest work, not because your name is attached to a building. If I sign those papers, everything changes. Victoria listened carefully. Marcus continued. I did not come here today expecting anything like this. I thought you wanted to meet and talk about the past. I thought maybe you simply wanted to know that I was doing all right. Victoria nodded slowly. I didn't want that. But I also wanted to make sure that the man who saved my life received the recognition he deserved. Marcus gave a quiet breath. Recognition is not always a good thing. Sometimes it attracts attention that changes the simple life you already have. The afternoon sunlight shifted slightly across the office floor as the sun moved lower outside the windows. Victoria walked toward the window and looked out across the city for a moment before turning back toward him. You believe that accepting this would make your life worse, she said thoughtfully. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath and looked again at the documents on the table. I believe it would make my life very different, he replied. And I have spent many years building a life that I understand. Victoria walked back toward the table. She could see that Marcus was not refusing the offer out of pride or fear. He was thinking carefully about the responsibility that would come with it. That realization made her respect him even more. Most people measure success by what they gain. Marcus seemed to measure it by what he might lose. Victoria placed her hands lightly on the table beside the folder. Marcus, she said softly, there is something you should know before you make your decision. This offer was never meant to be a reward for the past. Marcus looked up again, curious now. Then what is it for? He asked. Victoria met his gaze with quiet determination. Because the hotel you walked into today needs someone exactly like you. Marcus Reed looked at Victoria Bennett with quiet curiosity after her last words settled into the room. Because the hotel you walked into today needs someone exactly like you. For a moment, the sentence seemed to hang in the air between them like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Marcus leaned slightly against the edge of the table, his eyes thoughtful. I'm not sure I understand what you mean, he said calmly. Victoria nodded, as if she expected that reaction. She slowly closed the leather folder and rested both hands on top of it before speaking again. The Aurora Grand looks perfect from the outside, she said. People see the marble floors, the chandeliers, the elegant rooms, and they believe everything here runs smoothly. But businesses are like engines, Marcus. Even the most beautiful machine needs someone who understands how the parts truly work. Marcus allowed a faint smile at the comparison. Engines I understand, he replied. Hotels are a different kind of machine. Victoria shook her head gently. Not as different as you might think. She walked slowly toward the large window and looked down at the street far below, where cars moved through the city like a steady current. This building represents a dream that my father started many years ago, she said quietly. When he passed away, the responsibility became mine much sooner than I expected. For a long time, I believed the most important part of running a place like this was maintaining luxury and reputation. Marcus remained silent while she spoke. But the older I became, the more I realized something else, Victoria continued. Reputation is not built by marble floors or expensive furniture. It is built by the way people treat one another when no one important is watching. Marcus' eyes moved slightly as he listened. Victoria turned back toward him. You experienced that today when you walked into the lobby, she said. Marcus nodded slowly. I did. Victoria continued, speaking with quiet honesty. When I saw the way my own staff treated the man who once saved my life, I realized something important. The Aurora Grand has grown successful, but somewhere along the way we forgot the simple values that should guide every decision. Marcus folded his arms lightly as he considered her words. You believe I could help fix that problem, he said. Victoria stepped closer again. I believe you are exactly the kind of person who reminds others what dignity and respect look like. Marcus looked toward the closed folder again. But giving me part ownership of the hotel seems like a very large step just to make a point about values. Victoria allowed a small, thoughtful smile. It is not only about values. It is also about perspective. She moved to the table and reopened the folder. The documents inside described a new position connected to the ownership agreement. Marcus leaned slightly forward to read the heading more clearly. Community Partnership Director. Marcus looked up again. That sounds like a title designed for someone with a college education in business management, he said. Victoria shook her head. I already have people with degrees managing financial reports and marketing strategies. What I need is someone who understands ordinary people. Someone who remembers what it feels like to walk into a place where everyone assumes you do not belong. Marcus remained thoughtful. Victoria continued. I want the Aurora Grand to become a place that invests in the community around it. Training programs, apprenticeships, opportunities for people who work hard but never get a chance to walk through doors like these. Marcus slowly straightened. And you believe I should lead something like that? Victoria nodded firmly. I do. You know how to build trust because you've spent your life earning it. Marcus looked toward the skyline outside the window for a moment. The afternoon sun had begun to dip lower across the buildings of the city. When he finally spoke again, his voice was calm but sincere. That sounds like a responsibility much larger than fixing engines in a garage. Victoria smiled gently. Sometimes the most important engines are the ones that keep communities moving forward. Marcus considered the words carefully. The decision before him was no longer just about money or recognition. It was about stepping into a role that could change the lives of people far beyond himself. And for the first time since entering the Aurora Grand, Marcus Reed began to see why Victoria Bennett had waited so many years to find him. Marcus Reed stood quietly beside the wide office window while the late afternoon light stretched across the city skyline outside. The conversation with Victoria Bennett had shifted something inside him. When he first walked into the Aurora Grand that afternoon, he had expected nothing more than a simple meeting and perhaps a conversation about the past. Now he was standing in the owner-private office looking at an opportunity that could reshape not only his own future, but the future of many people who had never been given a chance to walk through doors like these. Victoria remained near the table, watching him carefully without rushing him toward an answer. She understood that the decision she had placed before him carried weight far beyond a signature on a document. Marcus finally turned away from the window and looked back at her. You said the hotel needs someone like me, he said slowly. Victoria nodded. Yes. Marcus folded his arms loosely across his chest as he considered the responsibility she had described. Helping people in the community is something I respect, he said. But you should understand something about the world I come from. Victoria listened without interrupting. Marcus continued speaking in a steady voice. In my neighborhood, people have heard promises like this before. Businesses say they want to help the community, but nothing really changes. Programs start with good intentions and then disappear once the attention fades. Victoria nodded thoughtfully. I know that happens. Marcus stepped closer to the table and looked again at the documents inside the folder. If I accept something like this, I would need to know that the work is real, he said. Not just something written on paper to make a company look generous. Victoria's expression remained calm but sincere. That is exactly why I want you involved, she said. I could hire another consultant with impressive degrees and polished speeches. But I would rather have someone who will challenge every decision we make if it does not truly help the people it is meant to serve. Marcus studied her face for a moment, searching for any sign that the idea was simply a public relations strategy. Instead, he saw only determination. Victoria walked slowly toward the window beside him and looked out across the city. When my father built the Aurora Grand, he believed that success should create opportunity for others, she said quietly. Somewhere along the way, we became so focused on growing the business that we forgot to expand the opportunities around us. Marcus rested one hand on the back of a nearby chair as he listened. Victoria turned toward him again. Today in the lobby, you saw a small example of that problem. A man walked into a beautiful building and was judged before anyone asked his name. Marcus gave a faint nod. I noticed that. Victoria continued speaking with quiet honesty. If our own staff can make that mistake, then we have work to do. And I want that work to be guided by someone who has experienced the world outside these walls. Marcus looked down briefly, thinking about the moment in the lobby when security had stepped toward him. The memory did not fill him with anger. It reminded him how common those assumptions were in many places. When he spoke again, his voice carried calm seriousness. If I agree to help you with this project, then I would want to meet the people we are trying to serve. I want to talk to workers, students, families who need opportunities. Victoria smiled slightly. That is exactly how I hoped you would approach it. Marcus looked back at the folder one more time. His life, until that day, had been built around simple routines. Early mornings in the garage, the sound of engines being repaired, the satisfaction of solving practical problems with his hands. Yet the opportunity in front of him offered a different kind of work, one that might allow him to help others in ways he had never imagined. Marcus finally lifted the pen from the table and turned it slowly between his fingers. Victoria watched quietly without saying a word. After a moment, Marcus looked up again. I will not sign this today, he said calmly. Victoria raised an eyebrow with curiosity rather than disappointment. You will not. Marcus shook his head. Gently. Not yet. If I'm going to take on a responsibility like this, I want to see the community programs you have already started and understand what still needs to be built. Victoria studied him for a moment and then smiled with clear respect. That is a fair request, she said. Marcus placed the pen back on the table. Give me time to see the work with my own eyes. Then I will know whether I am the right person for this job. Victoria extended her hand toward him. Marcus Reed, she said, I have waited more than 10 years to have this conversation. I'm more than willing to give you the time you need. Marcus Reed shook Victoria Bennett's hand firmly, the quiet agreement between them settling into the warm light of the office. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city stretched out beyond the tall glass windows while the sound of distant traffic drifted faintly upward from the streets below. Victoria finally released his hand and walked back toward the table where the leather folder still rested. She closed it gently and placed it aside. That is fair, she said calmly. If you're going to help shape the future of this place, then you deserve to see the truth of how it operates first. Marcus nodded once. I appreciate that. Victoria glanced at the clock on the wall and then toward the hallway outside her office. There is someone else I think you should meet before you leave today, she said. Marcus looked at her with curiosity. Who is that? Victoria smiled slightly. The person who manages most of the hotel daily operations. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Your nephew, Lucas Bennett. Victoria gave a quiet nod. Yes. Marcus let out a small breath. I'm not sure he will be very excited to meet me again after what happened in the lobby. Victoria's expression turned thoughtful. That is exactly why the conversation should happen. She walked to the office door and opened it, speaking briefly to an assistant in the hallway. A few minutes later, footsteps approached along the carpeted corridor. Lucas Bennett appeared in the doorway, his posture formal but noticeably tense. His eyes moved from Victoria to Marcus and back again. You asked to see me, he said. Victoria gestured for him to step inside. Lucas entered the office slowly, clearly, aware that this meeting was different from their usual discussions about business operations. Marcus stood quietly near the window while Lucas remained closer to the door. Victoria closed the door behind him and walked back toward the center of the room. Lucas, she said calmly, I believe you and Marcus should speak openly before he leaves today. Lucas looked at Marcus again, his earlier confidence from the lobby now replaced with uncertainty. I owe you an apology, Lucas said after a moment. Marcus shook his head slightly. You were doing your job, he replied. Lucas lowered his gaze briefly. Maybe, but I also made assumptions I should not have made. Victoria watched the exchange carefully but did not interrupt. Lucas continued speaking, his voice more sincere now. When you walked into the lobby, I judged you based on how you looked. That was a mistake. Marcus considered the words before answering. It happens more often than you might think, he said calmly. Lucas gave a quiet nod. I believe that now. He looked toward the folder on the table. My aunt explained the opportunity she offered you. Marcus nodded slightly. She did. Lucas folded his hands together, thinking carefully before speaking again. If you decide to accept that position, then you would be working closely with the hotel leadership team. That includes me. Marcus smiled faintly. I had a feeling it might. Lucas managed a small smile in return, though it carried a hint of humility. I hope the next time we work together, it will begin under better circumstances. Marcus extended his hand toward him. Lucas hesitated only a second before shaking it firmly. The simple gesture seemed to dissolve the remaining tension in the room. Victoria watched the moment with quiet satisfaction. "This is exactly the kind of change I want to see in this building," she said softly. "Honest conversations and people willing to learn from their mistakes." Lucas nodded slowly. "If Marcus joins the team, then I will support the work completely," he said. Marcus looked between the two of them. "I have not made my decision yet," he reminded them gently. "Victoria Ismail, and you will take the time you need." Lucas walked toward the door, but paused before leaving. "Marcus," he said, "when you return to the lobby today, you will notice something different." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "What do you mean?" Lucas gave a small, thoughtful smile. "The staff downstairs have already received new instructions." Marcus looked curious. "Instructions about what?" Lucas opened the door and answered calmly. "About asking a person name before deciding whether they belong." Lucas Bennett's words remained in Marcus' read mind as the office door closed behind him. About asking a person name before deciding whether they belong. The sentence was simple, but the meaning behind it carried weight that reached far beyond the walls of the Aurora Grand. Marcus walked beside Victoria Bennett down the quiet hallway outside her office, the soft carpet muffling their footsteps while the evening light began to dim through the tall windows along the corridor. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "That was not easy for him," Marcus said calmly. Victoria nodded without hesitation. "No, it was not, but it was necessary." They reached the private elevator and stepped inside. The doors closed, and the elevator began to descend smoothly through the building. Victoria looked toward Marcus again. "People are capable of learning if they are willing to face their mistakes," she said. Marcus rested one hand lightly against the railing along the wall of the elevator. "That is true," he replied. "The real question is whether the lesson lasts longer than the moment." Victoria smiled fondly. "That is why change has to be built into the system, not just spoken about in meetings." The elevator continued downward until it slowed near the lobby level. Marcus could already hear the distant sounds of conversation and quiet music rising through the building as the doors prepared to open. When the doors slid apart, the lobby of the Aurora Grand appeared again before them, though the atmosphere felt noticeably different from the moment Marcus had first walked inside earlier that afternoon. The receptionist behind the front desk looked up and immediately recognized Victoria. Her posture straightened, but when her eyes moved to Marcus, there was no hesitation or suspicion in her expression. "Good afternoon, Miss Bennett," she said politely. "And welcome back, sir." Marcus noticed the difference instantly. The simple greeting carried none of the doubt that had filled the room earlier. Victoria and Marcus stepped forward into the open space of the lobby, where several staff members were quietly speaking with one another near the concierge desk. When they noticed Marcus walking beside the owner of the hotel, they paused and offered respectful nods. Marcus looked around slowly. The marble floor, the tall columns, the soft music near the lounge area all looked exactly the same as before. Yet something in the way people carried themselves had shifted. A young bell attendant approached them with professional courtesy. "Is there anything you need before you leave this afternoon, sir?" he asked Marcus directly. Marcus gave a small appreciative nod. "No, thank you. I'm all set." The young man smiled politely and stepped aside. Victoria watched the exchange carefully. "Sometimes change begins with very small moments," she said quietly. Marcus looked toward the entrance doors where the sunlight now carried the warm tones of early evening. "That is how engines work too," he said. "A single small adjustment can change the way the entire machine runs." Victoria laughed softly at the comparison. "You always did see the world in practical ways." Marcus turned toward her again. "I'm at my set upstairs. I want to see the programs you described. I want to understand how the hotel plans to work with the community before I make a final decision." Victoria nodded firmly. "I will arrange for you to visit several of the neighborhoods where we hope to build partnerships. Training centers, apprenticeship programs, scholarship opportunities. I want you to see everything." Marcus extended his hand to her once more. "Thank you for the invitation today, Victoria." Victoria shook his hand warmly. And thank you for coming. Marcus began walking toward the front entrance of the hotel. The tall glass doors opened automatically as he approached. Just before stepping outside, he paused and looked back across the lobby one last time. Earlier that afternoon, he had walked into the Aurora Grand as a stranger who did not appear to belong. Now he walked out as someone whose presence had already begun to change the way the building treated the people who entered it. And although Marcus Reed had not yet signed the papers waiting upstairs in the office, the quiet transformation he had sparked inside the Aurora Grand had already begun. 3 months passed before Marcus Reed returned to the Aurora Grand Hotel. And when he stepped through the tall glass doors again, the feeling in the lobby was completely different from the day he first arrived. The marble floors still reflected the soft, golden light from the chandeliers above, and the quiet piano music still floated gently across the room. But the atmosphere carried a subtle warmth that had not been there before. This time when Marcus entered the building, the receptionist immediately looked up and smiled. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reed. Welcome back to the Aurora Grand." Marcus paused for a moment, surprised that she knew his name, then returned the greeting with a small nod. "Thank you. It is good to be back." Several staff members nearby acknowledged him politely as he crossed the lobby, and none of the eyes that followed him carried suspicion or judgment. The difference was small, but it was real. Over the past 3 months, Marcus had visited training centers that the hotel began supporting in nearby neighborhoods. He had spoken with young mechanics who wanted apprenticeships, students who dreamed of careers in hospitality, and families who had never imagined that a place like the Aurora Grand might invest in their future. He had spent long evenings walking through community workshops and listening more than speaking. And what he saw convinced him that the opportunity Victoria Bennett offered was not just an idea written on paper. It was already beginning to move forward. As Marcus walked toward the private elevators that afternoon, he noticed Lucas Bennett standing near the concierge desk, speaking with 2 new employees. Lucas saw him approaching and stepped forward with a respectful smile. "Good to see you again, Marcus." Marcus shook his hand. "Good to see you too, Lucas." Lucas glanced around the lobby for a moment. "Things look a little different since your last visit." Marcus noticed the subtle pride in his voice. "They do." Lucas nodded toward the front desk. "We change our training process for every employee. The first rule now is simple. Ask a person name before deciding anything else." Marcus smiled faintly. "That sounds like a good place to start." Lucas gestured toward the elevator. "She is waiting for you upstairs." Marcus stepped into the private elevator and rode quietly to the top floor once again. When the doors opened, Victoria Bennett was already standing inside her office near the window, the same leather folder resting on the table where it had been months earlier. She turned as Marcus entered and smiled warmly. "I was hoping you would come back today." Marcus walked toward the table and looked down at the folder. "I needed time to understand what you were building," he said. "Victoria Nadif." And now, Marcus picked up the pen resting beside the documents. "Now I know this work matters." He opened the folder, reviewed the first page one more time, and signed his name slowly across the document. Victoria watched quietly as the pen moved across the paper. When Marcus finished, he placed the pen down and looked up at her. "I am ready to help build something that gives people real opportunity," he said. Victoria extended her hand, and Marcus shook it firmly. Outside the office window, the city stretched into the distance, filled with thousands of people whose futures might one day cross paths with the opportunities now beginning inside the Aurora Grand. And the man who had once been asked to leave the lobby now held a place at the table where the future of the building would be decided. Because sometimes the person the world tries to turn away is exactly the person who reminds it what respect and dignity truly look like.